All right, this is Lecture 9, Observational Research. This covers the second half of Moorling Chapter 6. Again, this lecture is meant to supplement but not be a substitute for reading the chapter. So, in terms of learning objectives, you should be able to describe how researchers can make observations with good construct validity, describe how observational techniques for measurement are different than survey techniques, and also explain ways to improve the construct validity of observations by reducing observer bias, observer effects, and target reactivity. So, why do we do observational research? One reason is that some scientists think that it is better than self-report. One reason is that it avoids several of the problems with surveys and other self-report measures. As we've talked about with surveys and other self-report measures, it relies on people being able to accurately self-report their behaviors, and sometimes this is not the case. So it also avoids problems due to social desirability bias and avoids any issues with people's memories. And really, this is the best approach if the construct of interest is people's behavior. Self-report is often ideal to get at people's attitudes or their feelings, but if we're interested in behavior, it's best to observe people's behaviors rather than to ask them about their behaviors. So Moorling gave several different examples of types of observational studies, and I think it's instructive to take a look at some of these just to get a sense of what observational research looks like. So one example from the chapter came from a study by Mel et al. And this was based on observing how much people talk. They developed an electronically activated recorder, or an EAR, to observe what people said in their everyday conversations. The EAR had a microphone and a digital recording device. So the research assistants were able to transcribe what the person said while they were being recorded. And what ultimately came out of this research was that they found that despite stereotypes of women being more talkative than men, women did not use significantly more words than men as recorded by the digital recording device. So this was a really good observational study to be able to investigate this stereotype. And it was powerful because by actually looking at what people did and actually recording the behaviors of the spoken words, they were able to show that women did not use more words on average. So if you look at the numbers in the table, women's number is larger, but it's not a statistically significant difference. Another example from the chapter had to do with Bowker et al., and they looked at hockey moms and dads at 69 games. I guess in Canada, it wasn't unusual to hear about parents acting aggressively at their youth ice hockey games. So kind of similar to like baseball or soccer in the US. So Canadian researchers wanted to see how common it actually was. So they observed a sample of hockey games and recorded the frequency of violent and negative behavior, as well as positive and supportive behavior by parents. And they found that 64% of parents' comments were positive, but only 4% were negative. So the results of their research did not support the reports that had been in the media of all of this violence that was happening among parents at these games. And then a third example that the chapter used looked at observing families in the evening. So in this research, Both parents from dual earner families were followed by a camera crew from the time they left work until 8 p.m. And then a variety of behaviors were coded from the videotapes, including the emotional tone of the parents and the topics of the conversations during dinner. So, in terms of emotional tone, the researchers rated each parent on a 7-point scale from 1, which was cold or hostile, to 7, which is warm or happy. So they found that emotional tone was overall slightly positive. They looked at the topics of dinner conversations. They found that children were more likely to complain about the taste of the food, whereas the parents were more likely to talk about how nutritious the tone was. And they also found that mothers had a more negative emotional tone than fathers when kids expressed displeasure at whatever they were eating. And maybe that's because it was more common for the mothers to be the ones that actually made the food. So, again, just another example of observational research and the types of research questions that can be answered. Okay, so it's important for researchers to think about how to make reliable and valid observations. And one thing that can get in the way is observer bias. This is when observers' expectations influence their interpretations of participants' behavior or the outcome of the research. So this could occur when observers rate behaviors according to their own expectations or hypotheses instead of rating behaviors objectively. Okay, and so this could have been a problem potentially in the dinner time study that I just reviewed, or even the hockey game, is that when reviewing and making observations or reviewing the videotape, as people were coding the video or they were coding the interactions of parents, if they had their own preconceptions or if they had their own predictions or hypotheses, they might have been more inclined to code a particular behavior as perhaps being negative in the case of the hockey moms and dads, potentially as a way to fit their hypothesis. So Moreland gave an example in the chapter that was fairly striking. So in a study by Langer and Abelson, therapists were given a videotape of a man in his mid-20s being interviewed. Before viewing the video, half were told that the man was a graduate student and half were told that he was a criminal. Okay, and so therapist told the man was a graduate student and was interviewing, described him as attractive, candid, and innovative. And then if he was told that not a criminal but a patient, he was referred to as tight, defensive, and frightened of his own aggressive impulses. So therapists that watched the exact same video, but were given the expectation that the person was a graduate student versus and interviewing for a job versus a patient, described the same person and the same behavior much differently. So that has to do with observer bias, is that it's our expectations influence our observations, what we see. Okay, so there's also something called observer effects, and this is when observers change the behavior of participants to match their expectation. This is sometimes also described as expectancy effects. And the chapter gave a couple different examples of observer effects or expectancy effects. The first one had to do with the bright and dull rat study. In this study, psychology undergraduates were given 5 rats and told to see how long it would take for their rats to learn how to run a maze. Each student was given a randomly selected group of rats, but half were told that their rats were bred to be smart. In other words, they were specifically called maze bright. The other half were told that their rats were bred to be maze dull. That is, not very good at running rats. The rats were actually all genetically similar, but it turned out that the maze bright rats ran the maze faster each day and with fewer mistakes, whereas the maze dull rats didn't improve their performance over several days. How did that happen? Well, the study was meant to demonstrate that sometimes observers' own expectations can influence the behavior of those that they're observing. So they must have done something, these psychology students must have done something to make the rats either do better or worse. The other example given in the chapter is the story of Clever Hans, the horse. Clever Hans was a horse that, it was said, could add, subtract, multiply, and divide at least as well as a fifth grader. He was tutored in simple mathematics by his trainer, and he tapped his hoof on the ground to count. Interestingly, the trainer was not the only person that could get Hans to do this type of math. So you could give other people a math problem and Hans would be able to get the right answer. However, researchers suspected that the horse was picking up on subtle nonverbal cues from the people that were giving him the questions. So in order to see if that was what was happening, they had one person whisper the first part of the problem in Hans's ear, and the second person whisper the second part of the math problem. Neither the questioner knew the correct answer because they only knew the part of the problem they whispered. And so, in fact, Hans would not answer these math questions correct. So the horse was very smart, but just not in math. He was skilled at detecting subtle nonverbal cues, such as the questioner's changes in posture or nodding a head is a way to guess the answer. So those are two examples of observer effects. So how to prevent both observer bias and observer effects? One way is to have very clear rating scales as well as code books. So a code book is something that would be definitions of behaviors as well as examples. So it's a way for raters or judges to have a very clear and objective standard for indicating whether a behavior is present or not. So that would be one way, is to use a code book. The second way would be to use a masked or blind research design. In a masked design, observers do not know which conditions the participants have been assigned to. Okay, so a blind can be imposed on participants, researchers, technicians, data analysts, as well as evaluators. Okay, so in medical trials, it's common to have a single blind design, which blinds patients to the treatment, or perhaps you've heard of a double blind trial in which both patients and researchers are blind to what the study is about. So as a way to present these observer biases and effects, those different blinds are put into place. In addition to observers having bias, it's also the case that participants can change their behavior when they know that they're being observed. And this is called reactivity. The Hawthorne Effect is a special type of reactivity in which individuals modify their behavior in response to being observed. In the original research at the Hawthorne Works in Cicero, Illinois, changes in lighting and work structure were studied, as well as changes to working hours and break times. It was originally interpreted to mean that paying attention to overall worker needs would improve productivity. But essentially what they found in this research is that really just being observed at all led to changes in productivity, and it didn't necessarily have anything to do with differences in lighting or hours or breaks. Productivity went up across the board if people were observed. So that became known as the Hawthorne Effect. And there's a link in the notes to a YouTube video that gives you a short description of the original Hawthorne studies. So how to reduce reactivity? The first thing would be to use unobtrusive observations. Basically blend in. Make yourself less obvious by observing through a one-way mirror, or observing from the back of the classroom, or observing in a place that people can't necessarily see you. The second solution would be to wait for participants to get used to you. So it could be a good idea to have participants get used to your presence by visiting the site that you're going to observe a couple times before, so that participants become familiar with you being around, get used to you, and don't change their behavior. The third thing would be to use physical traces. That is, measure the results of behavior. Okay, so instead of actually measuring behavior, sometimes researchers obtain traces of a behavior. So, for example, if you're interested in the amount and type of junk food that college students eat in a dorm setting or in a cafeteria, you can look at the wrappers in a dorm's garbage cans. Kind of gross, but that would be collecting traces of behavior rather than observing the behavior itself. Well, so how to do that ethically? Does it present an ethical dilemma if you're observing people's behaviors, but you're kind of hiding and they're not aware that you're observing their behavior? The short of it is, it depends. It really depends on the situation. Most researchers do think it's ethical to observe people's behaviors in public places. So, like at a bus stop or on a campus or at a park or a concert. It's important to know that scientists don't specifically identify the people that they observe when they report their research findings. It's people's identities are, still confidential. The use of one-way mirrors or hidden cameras might even be considered ethical in some situations, but only if it's public behaviors. In order to observe people's private behaviors, researchers would need to get permission in advance.